In this episode, we're going to build a reliable incident timeline in a way that makes it feel like a practical leadership tool rather than a forensic mystery. Beginners often hear timeline and imagine a long technical record of every log entry, but that kind of dump is not a timeline, it's noise. A reliable timeline is a structured, evidence-backed story of what happened, when it happened, what was confirmed, what actions were taken, and what decisions were made, all anchored to sources that can be trusted. Timelines matter because incidents create uncertainty, and uncertainty creates disagreement, and disagreement slows containment, weakens communication, and increases business impact. When the timeline is strong, the team shares a common reality, leadership can make better trade-offs, and updates to stakeholders can be accurate and consistent. When the timeline is weak, the incident becomes a collection of conflicting memories, and people start making decisions based on feelings or partial truths. By the end, you should be able to explain what makes a timeline reliable, how to build one under pressure, and how to use it for decisions, evidence, and updates without becoming tool-specific. A reliable timeline begins with a simple idea. Time is the only universal organizer in an incident, because everyone can argue about causes and severity, but time gives structure to events. The timeline is not just when the attacker did things. It also includes when you noticed things, when you verified them, and when you acted. That is important because leadership decisions depend on the sequence, such as whether containment happened before spread, whether communication happened before facts were confirmed, or whether recovery happened before trust was rebuilt. A good timeline also separates what is confirmed from what is suspected, because mixing those creates false certainty. For beginners, think of the timeline as the spine of the incident story, where each entry is a vertebra supported by evidence. If the spine is weak, the story collapses, and everything else becomes harder. The exam often tests this indirectly by presenting scenarios where the team is confused about sequence or where stakeholders receive inconsistent updates, which are classic signs of a weak timeline. One of the first reliability rules is consistency of time, because timestamps are only useful when they are comparable. In real environments, time settings can drift, logs can be in different time zones, and systems can record time differently. You don't need to know how time protocols work to understand the leadership principle. If times are inconsistent, the team can misorder events and draw wrong conclusions. A timeline builder must be alert to whether events came from different sources with different time representations and must document that context. For example, if one log source reports in local time and another reports in coordinated universal time, UTC, mixing them without clarity will scramble the story. Even if you don't fix the time difference immediately, you can still build a reliable timeline by noting the source and the time basis so the team doesn't treat it as absolute without verification. Reliability is not pretending everything is perfect. Reliability is being honest about uncertainty and documenting it. That honesty protects decisions and communication. Another reliability rule is choosing the right level of detail, because too much detail hides meaning and too little detail creates gaps. A useful timeline includes the key events that change the situation, such as first detection, first confirmation, major containment actions, major recovery steps, and major stakeholder communications. It also includes critical evidence points like confirmed unauthorized access, confirmed data exposure, or confirmed spread to additional systems. It does not need to include every alert or every system event, because that overwhelms readers and makes it harder to find what matters. Think of the timeline as a leadership view of the incident with evidence anchors, not as an exhaustive forensic log. If deeper detail is needed, it can be referenced separately, but the main timeline should remain readable and decision-ready. Beginners can remember this as the difference between a map and a satellite photo. The map shows the roads you need to navigate, while the photo includes everything and can be harder to use under pressure. The timeline is the map. Reliability also depends on sourcing, meaning each timeline entry should be tied to where the information came from. Sources can include logs, monitoring alerts, user reports, ticketing records, system messages, or responder observations. But the key is that the timeline should not be built purely from memory. Memory is especially unreliable during incidents because stress distorts perception and because people see only part of the picture. A good timeline builder asks, what evidence supports this time and this event, and then records the source so others can validate it. This sourcing is also essential for accountability and legal defensibility when stakes are high, because later questions often ask, "How do you know?" And a timeline built on evidence can answer that. For beginners, it helps to treat a timeline entry like a claim in a debate. You don't just state it, you support it. The exam might not ask you to build a timeline directly, but it often tests whether you value evidence-based records as the foundation of decisions and updates. A reliable timeline should include both attacker-related events and response-related events, because leadership decisions depend on both. Attacker-related events include suspicious activity, unauthorized access, lateral movement, data access, and disruption patterns, as confirmed by evidence. Response-related events include when the incident was declared, when key roles were engaged, when containment actions were taken, and when recovery steps began. Decision-related events include approvals, escalations, and changes in response goals as the incident evolved. Communication-related events include stakeholder notifications, external statements, if any, and critical internal updates. This matters because the timeline is not only about understanding what happened, it is about demonstrating that the response was disciplined and that communications were grounded in reality. If you only record attacker actions and ignore response actions, you miss the leadership story that stakeholders and auditors often care about. If you only record response actions and ignore attacker activity, you can't justify why the response choices made sense. A complete timeline ties both together, showing how evidence drove action over time. Now let's connect timeline building to incident tracking, because these two practices reinforce each other. Tracking focuses on tasks, owners, deadlines, and status, while the timeline focuses on what happened and when, including both events and decisions. In practice, a decision to isolate a system should appear in the timeline as a decision and action, and it should appear in tracking as a task with an owner and completion status. If tracking says the system was isolated but the timeline doesn't reflect when and why, you lose the narrative and evidence chain. If the timeline shows a containment action but tracking doesn't show ownership and verification, you risk assuming containment happened without proof. Reliability comes from alignment. The timeline and the task record should tell the same story. For beginners, you can think of tracking as the team's work plan and the timeline as the team's incident story, and both must match. Exam scenarios that include confusion about what has been done often point to misalignment between these records, and the best leadership move is often to reconcile and consolidate them. A major challenge is building the timeline while the incident is still active because people are busy and information is changing. The leadership answer is to treat timeline maintenance as a role, not as an afterthought, because if nobody owns it, it will drift. The incident manager often owns this or assigns someone to support it, especially when the incident is complex. The goal during the incident is not to build a perfect historical record, but to maintain a useful, current view that supports decisions and updates. That means adding entries promptly, marking uncertain items clearly, and updating entries as evidence improves. It also means resisting the temptation to rewrite history to make it look cleaner, because reliability comes from accuracy, not from neatness. A timeline can include corrections, such as noting that an earlier assumption was revised after new evidence appeared, and that is a sign of disciplined response, not weakness. For beginners, it's helpful to understand that timeline building is a living activity during response, and then it becomes refined later during after-action review. Timeline reliability also depends on discipline language, because vague wording makes it hard to know what is actually confirmed. Phrases like might have, could be, and possibly are not wrong, but they should be used carefully and explicitly because they indicate uncertainty. Phrases like confirmed, validated, and observed indicate stronger confidence and should be reserved for situations where evidence supports them. When you use careful language, you prevent the common incident problem where a hypothesis spreads through the organization as if it were fact. That matters for business impact because decisions, public messaging, and customer communication can be harmed by inaccurate claims. A reliable timeline helps prevent that by clearly distinguishing what is known from what is suspected. It also gives stakeholders a stable foundation for planning because they can see what has changed and what is still being investigated. The exam often rewards this careful thinking because incident leadership is as much about managing uncertainty as it is about managing technology. Another important reliability practice is capturing the first time you knew something, not just the first time it happened. This sounds subtle, but it matters because incident response is shaped by awareness. For example, an attacker might have been active for days, but the organization might not have detected it until a certain time and then took action later. Recording those points helps evaluate detection and response effectiveness, and it also helps explain decisions. It also supports learning, because if the timeline shows a long gap between attacker activity and detection, the organization might invest in improved monitoring or training. If it shows a long gap between detection and containment, the organization might improve escalation paths and pre-approve decisions. This is how a timeline becomes an improvement tool, not just a history. For beginners, the takeaway is that a timeline should capture both the incident's progression and the response's progression, because both are needed to understand what to improve. Timelines also support evidence handling and chain of custody thinking, even if you are not doing formal legal procedures in every incident. If evidence was collected, the timeline can record when it was collected and what it related to, which helps preserve context and reduces later confusion. When evidence changes or is overwritten by response actions, the timeline can capture that, which helps explain limitations in later analysis. This is especially important when the incident involves sensitive data or potential legal consequences, because later questions may require demonstrating that actions were disciplined and evidence was protected as much as feasible. Reliability here is about preserving the story of evidence, not just the story of events. A timeline that includes evidence collection and key decisions can show that the team acted responsibly and with awareness of accountability. That supports trust, which is part of business impact management. On the exam, answers that emphasize preserving evidence and maintaining defensible records often align with best incident leadership practice. Finally, a reliable timeline is a communication tool because it provides a stable basis for updates to stakeholders. Stakeholders don't need every technical detail, but they do need a coherent story of what is happening, what has been done, what is the current impact, and what is expected next. A timeline allows the incident manager and communications lead to provide updates that are consistent over time because they can reference the same source of truth. It also helps avoid contradictions, such as saying containment was achieved when the timeline shows new suspicious activity after containment was supposedly complete. Reliable updates reduce rumor and reduce stakeholder anxiety, which makes decision-making smoother and prevents unnecessary interference with response work. For beginners, the simplest way to see this is that a timeline turns messy events into a narrative you can communicate responsibly. When you can communicate responsibly, you reduce secondary harm, like reputational damage or internal confusion, and that is part of effective incident leadership. To close, building a reliable incident timeline is about creating a time-ordered, evidence-backed record that supports decisions, protects evidence, and enables accurate updates. Reliability comes from consistent time context, the right level of detail, clear sourcing, disciplined language that distinguishes confirmed facts from hypotheses, and inclusion of both attacker activity and response actions. The timeline works best when it is maintained as a living record during the incident, owned by someone responsible for keeping it current, and aligned with task tracking so the story of work matches the story of events. A strong timeline reduces chaos by giving the team a shared reality, and it improves leadership decisions by showing sequence, impact, and progress clearly. On the GCIL exam, scenarios often test whether you understand the value of this discipline, because incident leaders are judged by their ability to create clarity under pressure. When you can explain what makes a timeline reliable and how it supports decisions and communication, you are demonstrating a core incident leader capability.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.